it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
Good evening, all you poor, unfortunate souls. Some of you might be wondering, where in the fathoms below have I been lately? My videos have been released on a kind of wonky schedule. I haven't been around for the Sunday streams. I'm a very busy woman and I haven't got all day. Between rehearsals, tech week, and beginning the run of the show I'm currently in, I have been up to my gills in work and exhaustion. And while I absolutely love it, feels like I've been swirling around in a whirlpool for the past several weeks. But I am finally sailing towards calmer seas, and while my schedule is still keeping me running a tight ship, I wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk about the subject of the show that has been gulping down all my time and energy lately. In case the various puns and references didn't give it away, it's The Little Mermaid. Now, heave ho, Elise, I can hear you saying. The Little Mermaid isn't horror, especially not the Disney version. Unless you count the horror many parents found themselves stricken with due to a certain component of the VHS cover in the 90s. And sure as dogfish bites, you'd be right. But in today's pond-sized minisode, I would like to talk about some of the horrific elements that are present in the 1837 story by Danish author Hans Christian Andersen. Okay, I'll try to reel in the puns, guys, but I've got like a trillion of these. So, like most popularized fairy tales, the original version of The Little Mermaid is much darker and decidedly more tragic than the sanitized, often Disney-fied versions of the 20th and 21st centuries. And it's safe to say that most modern audiences have an at least passing awareness of some of the more macabre aspects of fairy tales. The evil queen in Snow White is forced to dance in iron-hot shoes until she drops dead. Cinderella's stepsisters and stepmother have their eyes pecked out by birds. Rumpelstiltskin stomps into the ground and tears himself in half. The list goes on and on. The messaging of most fairy tales is typically moralistic or cautionary in nature, if not both. Much like scary stories, fairy tales have been used as a means to scare us into being good and or to avoid danger. The Little Mermaid, however, takes a different approach, at least in my opinion. And the reason for this is that The Little Mermaid wasn't written primarily as a lesson. It was an expression of heartbreak and pain, and sometimes the best or worst horror comes from the heart. And before we dive into all the heartache that set The Little Mermaid sailing into existence, I just want to briefly summarize Hans Christian Andersen's original story. So The Little Mermaid lives in an underwater kingdom with her widowed father, her grandmother, and her 5 older sisters. She's fascinated by the world above and longs to see it for herself. When she turns 15, she's finally allowed to visit the surface, where she witnesses the birthday celebration of a handsome young prince being held on a ship. A violent storm hits, sinking the ship, and the Little Mermaid rescues the prince from drowning. She delivers him unconscious to a shore where a young woman and her ladies-in-waiting discover him. Now, heartsick for the prince and dismayed upon finding out that mermaids, unlike humans, have a 300-year lifespan, but do not have an immortal soul, the Little Mermaid visits the Sea Witch, who gives her a potion that will give her legs in exchange for her beautiful voice. And she will obtain a soul only if she wins the love of the prince and marries him, for then a part of his soul will flow into her. Otherwise, at dawn of the first day after he marries someone else, the Little Mermaid will die of a broken heart and dissolve into foam on the waves. Upon transforming into a human, she's found by the prince, who becomes enchanted by her despite her being mute, and loves to watch her graceful, beautiful dancing. Now, even though the Little Mermaid becomes the prince's favorite companion, he professes that he can only love the woman who he believes rescued him from the sea. However, Turns out that the princess from the neighboring kingdom is the same girl who found the prince on the beach that day. And thinking that she was his savior, the prince immediately professes his love for her, and the royal wedding begins. On the night of the wedding, the Little Mermaid's sisters rise to the surface, their hair being cut off in exchange for a dagger from the sea witch that will release the mermaid from her contract if she stabs the prince in the heart and lets his blood flow onto her legs. She will get her tail back and be able to rejoin her family in the ocean. However, she cannot bring herself to kill the prince, and the Little Mermaid throws herself into the water as dawn breaks, dissolving into foam. However, she has been turned into an ethereal, earthbound spirit called a daughter of the air, who, because of her selflessness, has been given the chance to earn her own soul by doing good deeds for 300 years and will one day rise to heaven. Now, with the plot outline out of the way, let's just take a quick look at the naturalistic terror embodied by the mermaids themselves. So unlike the predatory, deliberately destructive motives shown by other mermaids and mermaid-like creatures throughout legends and folklore all over the world, the mermaids in Andersen's story are quite naive to the danger they present to humans. They simply are what they are. And they seem to genuinely want to show sailors just how beautiful their undersea home is. Andersen writes, "On many an evening, the older sisters would rise to the surface, arm in arm, all five in a row. They had beautiful voices, more charming than those of any mortal beings. When a storm was brewing and they anticipated a shipwreck, they would swim before the ship and sing most seductively of how beautiful it was at the bottom of the ocean, trying to overcome the prejudice that the sailors had against coming down to them. But people could not understand their song and mistook it for the voice of the storm. Nor was it for them to see the glories of the deep. When their ship went down, they were drowned, and it was as dead men that they reached the Sea King's palace." Now, whether the mermaids just don't understand the limitations of the human body in water, want to ease the passage from life into death with their songs of the wonders of the deep, or some combination of both, they represent the mystery and capriciousness of the natural world that we humans cannot fathom nor traverse. They're not evil, but they're not good either. Their whims are simply part of what they are, and for a species desperate to assign order and reasoning to make sense of the world, these mermaids remind us that nature is terrifying in its unpredictability and indifference towards our comfort and our safety. And there's also a certain existential terror that exists in The Little Mermaid, that being the question of the immortal soul. The Little Mermaid herself appears to be the only one of her kind to wrestle with this, or at least the only one to grieve the impermanence of her own existence. The other merfolk don't think too much of the beyond, or lack thereof. They're content to exist, to live, and then simply cease to be once their 300 years under the sea is done. Now, there's something peaceful, almost liberating about that view. Like the natural world they are a part of, the mermaids don't need to worry or plan or contend with the broader implications of their existence or actions. They can just be. The Little Mermaid, however, alone faces the burden of contemplating what her life means without even the possibility of a soul that might carry on after death. The text reads, "Why weren't we given an immortal soul?" the Little Mermaid sadly asked. "I would gladly give up my 300 years if I could be a human being only for a day and later share in that heavenly realm." "You must not think about that," said her grandmother. "We fare much more happily and are much better off than the folk up there." The Little Mermaid was destined to be a tragic, cursed character, even if she had never become a human and tried to win the heart of the prince. Separate from the rest of her community, she alone bears the weight of existential horror. knowing that death will come, that everything she is will cease to be, and that she can't change that, but she longs to. No one around her can understand or sympathize with her plight, and at the end of her long life, she cannot contentedly fade into nothing like the rest of her family will. She will regret the inability to pass on to another realm and will die with that regret and grief in her heart. That's a cruel and chilling fate. Now, if you'll indulge me, oh, hey guys, it's my video. You have to. I feel compelled to read the description of the Sea Witch's lair. For not being a horror story, this is honestly one of the most evocative, creepy passages I can think of. I have to wonder if, actual horror novelists drew inspiration from both the imagery and from Hans Christian Andersen's narrative voice. And especially after reading Stephen King's novel Fairy Tale, I honestly would be very surprised. So, here goes. The little mermaid set out from her garden toward the whirlpools that raged in front of the witch's dwelling. She had never gone that way before. No flowers grew there, nor any seaweed. Bare and gray, the sands extended to the whirlpools were like roaring mill wheels. The waters whirled and snatched everything within their reach down to the bottom of the sea. Between these tumultuous whirlpools, she had to thread her way to reach the witch's waters. And then for a long stretch, the only trail lay through a hot, seething mire, which the witch called her peat marsh. Beyond it, her house lay in the middle of a weird forest, where all the trees and shrubs were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the soil. All their branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like wriggling worms. They squirmed, joint by joint, from their roots to their outermost tentacles, and whatever they could lay hold of, they twined around and never let go. The little mermaid was terrified and stopped at the edge of the forest. Her heart thumped with fear, and she nearly turned back. But then she remembered the prince and the souls that men have, and she summoned her courage. She bound her long flowing locks closely through the water like the fish, She bound her long flowing locks closely about her head so that the polyps could not catch hold of them, folded her arms across her breasts, and darted through the water like a fish, in among the slimy polyps that stretched out their writhing arms and fingers to seize her. She saw that every one of them held something that it had caught with its hundreds of little tentacles, and to which it clung as with strong hoops of steel. The white bones of men who had perished at sea and sunk to these depths could be seen in the polyps' arms. Ships' rudders and seamen's chests and the skeletons of land animals had also fallen into their clutches. But the most ghastly sight of all was a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled. She reached a large muddy clearing in the forest where big fat water snakes slithered about, showing their foul yellowish bellies. In the middle of this clearing was a house built of the bones of shipwrecked men, and there sat the sea witch, letting a toad eat out of her mouth, just as we might feed sugar to a little canary bird. She called the ugly fat water snakes her little chickabiddies and let them crawl and sprawl about on her spongy bosom. Eat your heart out, Lovecraft. Now, I would love to see a source-accurate adaptation of The Little Mermaid for the Sea Witch's lair alone. Like maybe directed by Guillermo del Toro, or an animated feature that actually reflects the dark tone. I would love that even more than I love Les Poissons. So now we come to sort of main event, the big kahuna, the eye of the hurricane. The body horror of The Little Mermaid. The body horror presented in the story isn't just to provide a compelling or shocking narrative. It's a physical manifestation of Hans Christian Andersen's emotional pain. Now, firstly, The Little Mermaid loses her voice, not through means of sorcery as in the Disney version. The sea witch cuts out her tongue. This poor sweet child loses her ability to speak, to sing, to express herself in a horrific and painful way. Anderson himself was silenced, and the finality and the pain of the mermaid's tongue being removed reflects his own struggle. Hans Christian Andersen was in love with Duke Edvard Cullen, a man who he could never love openly outside of his letters of longing and adoration, and a man who did not reciprocate his feelings. And even if there was any reciprocation on Collins's behalf, he did what society and his title demanded of him. He married a lady. And regardless if Collin shared any amount of Andersen's affections, Andersen could never speak of his desires or his truth in the world and time that he lived in. All he could do was write his love into his stories and pretend for the world to see that all was well, even while his heart broke anew time and time again. And this is where the other body horror element comes into play. The Little Mermaid's legs when she's transformed into a human. Now, the sea witch warns her of the physical price she'll pay for gaining legs. Every step you take will feel as if you were treading upon knife blades so sharp that blood must flow. With the loss of her voice, the Little Mermaid's graceful, mesmerizing dancing is the only way to charm the prince. And the only way she can express her love and devotion is to be in constant, fresh agony. And like the mermaid of his story, Andersen bore the pain of his unexpressed, unrequited love every day. I mean, and having someone you love so deeply, being unable and unallowed to tell them to be with them because who you are and the world you live in will not allow it. That's 56 levels of hell. And I think most of us have gone through something along those lines on a much lesser scale in our lives. Probably safe to say that we've all had a crush or been into somebody that did not like us back. High school was a thing. I've been there. But on this level where it was Andersen, his queerness would not allow him to be with somebody that he loved, and then this person, and it's debated a bit if they were completely platonic friends or if there was some affection shared, but maybe just not quite as much as on Andersen's side of it. But either way, the situation and the world and who he was could not let him express openly the way he felt. And he had to write that into The Little Mermaid as this young girl from the sea walking around on razor blades every single day just to get by, but just to make her, the object of her love, smile because he loved to watch her dance. And just thinking about all of that, that is horrific to me. And I really, I have to wonder if The Little Mermaid, if it really should be considered more of a scary story or more of a horror story than it typically is. And for everything that I've talked about, just the evocative and creepy manner that the Sea Witch's lair and the Sea Witch herself are described, and the terror of the sailors hearing the mermaids' voices, the mermaids themselves being these naturalistic creatures that just kind of watch men die and like, oh, okay. And the body horror in and of itself, it's bloody, it's dark, it's incredibly, incredibly sad. But I think part of why The Little Mermaid as a tale has become so popular and has stayed within the public consciousness, I mean, obviously the Disney adaptation and the music of the Disney version itself, it's so wonderful. But because of that truth that is inherent within the text, and because of Hans Christian Andersen's own sad, unrealized love story, I think it has persisted and will continue to do so for many, many more years to come. And was I going out on a little bit of a limb here to talk about The Little Mermaid because it has been the only thing been thinking about for the past month or so? Yeah, a little bit. But I did just want to highlight the elements of horror that are present in the story and kind of in fairy tales in general, which is something I would like to dig into a little more deeply in another video at some point in time. But for The Little Mermaid, I had to. I had to. And I hope that even though this is not my usual brand, this is a bit of a stretch, but I hope that you can appreciate it for what it is. And maybe think about some of the things you read or read as a kid or read to your own children. Where did these dark elements come from? What should we make of the horror that we see in fairy tales and folklore that have become so familiar to us that we don't really consider it? But I think that we should, because it makes the stories that much richer and deeper and a little bit scarier, which is something I am always, always a fan of. I wish I had another fish pun to end this video on. I feel like I expended all of them in the beginning, and now I'm just drowning. There it was. Okay. Thank you for watching this video. I will be back with a more normal schedule and back to classic or more classic horror in the next coming week and weeks to follow. Thank you for being patient with me and with Dino while my schedule has been all strange and crazy, but that's life under the sea for ya. Take care, all of my lovely friends, and as always, stay spooky.